Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the most misunderstood worlds in all of human history. And I want to start with a question, because I think it is the right place to begin. When you close your eyes and picture a pirate, what do you see? Take a moment. Really picture it. I am guessing you see someone tall and weathered, standing at the helm of a magnificent ship, coat billowing in the salt wind, a gleaming cutlass at one hip, a flintlock pistol at the other. The sky behind them is an improbable shade of Caribbean blue. The ship is enormous and dramatic, its black sails catching the light perfectly. There is probably some treasure involved. There is almost certainly rum. There is, let us be honest, almost always a parrot. Maybe a hat with a skull on it. The whole thing looks like an adventure. It looks like freedom. It looks like the kind of life you might fantasize about on a particularly difficult Monday morning when your inbox is full and the coffee has gone cold. I understand that image completely. It is a romantic image. It is a powerful image. It is an image that has been carefully constructed and refined and polished by novelists and filmmakers and everyone who ever wanted to sell you a ticket or a book or a themed restaurant experience. And it is, I am very sorry to have to tell you this, almost entirely wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in the details. Wrong in its fundamental premise, which is that life on a pirate ship was something you would enjoy. Because here is what they never put on the movie poster. The smell. The genuinely extraordinary, historically documented, physically overwhelming smell of a wooden sailing ship in the early 1700s, crewed by 80 men who had not properly washed since they left port 6 weeks ago. The food, and I use that word with a generosity I am not entirely sure the subject matter deserves. The crushing, relentless, soul-dissolving boredom of the weeks and months between any actual action, when the only thing on the horizon was more horizon, and the only variation in the daily routine was whether the weevils in your biscuit were large or small. The disease that killed far more pirates than any sword fight, any cannonball, any naval battle ever did. The sleeping arrangements, which made the most budget-conscious hostel dormitory look like a carefully considered 5-star hotel suite. The rats, my friends. I cannot stress this enough. The absolute, teeming, confident, well-established, completely irreducible number of rats. Tonight, over the next few hours, we are going to leave the myth at the dock. We are going to step aboard a real pirate ship. We are going to follow a real crew through a real day, and then a real week, and then a real life, and discover what daily existence during the Golden Age of Piracy was actually like. And I promise you, it is stranger and grimmer and funnier and more genuinely impressive than anything you have ever seen on screen. Before we cast off and set sail together, I have a small request. If you enjoy these late-night journeys into the stranger corners of history, if this channel is part of your wind-down routine, please take just a moment to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video, but only if it genuinely speaks to you. No pressure, no guilt. I just love knowing you are here. And I am genuinely curious. Where in the world are you right now? Is it dark where you are? What time is it? Drop a comment and let me know, because I find it quietly wonderful that someone in New Zealand and someone in Germany and someone in Ohio are all lying in the dark at completely different hours, listening to the exact same story. You can also find us on Spotify if you prefer to listen while you do other things. The link is in the description. Now dim those lights a little more. Pull that blanket up. Maybe turn on a fan if you have one, because that soft white noise does something to a tired brain that nothing else quite matches. Let your shoulders drop. Take one slow breath. Let the day go. And let us begin. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to imagine this with me. The year is 1710. The place is somewhere in the warm blue sprawl of water between Hispaniola and the Bahamas. The sun is climbing high in a sky that is too blue to be quite believable, and the air is so thick with heat and humidity that breathing feels like a small continuous effort. You are standing on a dock in a ramshackle harbour town. The dock itself is rotting in places, the wood grey and soft from years of salt and sun. Fishing nets are spread on the ground nearby. Goats are investigating the contents of an overturned crate. And there, tied up before you, is a pirate sloop. Not a grand three-masted ship with towering sails like you might be imagining. Something smaller and meaner and faster. A sloop, probably about 70 or 80 feet long, built for speed, with a single tall mast and a long bowsprit jutting out over the water like a pointing finger. She sits low in the water. Her hull is dark with tar and age. Whatever paint might once have decorated her sides has long since peeled away in the tropical heat, leaving bare grey wood that has been patched and repatched in ways that suggest a complicated recent past. Ropes hang in every direction. The deck is cluttered with barrels, coils of heavy line, tools, weapons, and various objects that you are not entirely sure you want to try to identify. And on that deck and in that rigging and hanging out of those open gun ports, somewhere between 80 and 90 men are moving, arguing, sleeping, gambling, and generally existing in a space that is genuinely not large enough for 80 to 90 men in any comfortable sense of the term. The sound from here, standing on the dock, is a remarkable mixture. The creak of the hull against the dock timbers, the slap of small waves, the shouts of men speaking in English, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, and at least 2 West African languages. Someone is laughing. Someone else is very clearly arguing about something. A badly played fiddle is producing sounds somewhere forward. And the smell. Well, we will get to the smell. We are going to spend some time on the smell. This is the world we are entering tonight, not as tourists with a comfortable distance and an exit whenever we like. As crew. As people who eat what these men eat, sleep where they sleep, breathe what they breathe. By the time we are done, I think you will have a very different kind of respect for the people who chose this life. Or who had it chosen for them. Let us go aboard. The first thing you notice when you actually step onto a pirate ship, the very first thing, before you have a chance to notice anything else, is the smell. And I want to spend some real time here because this detail is so consistently left out of every pirate story ever told, and it matters enormously for understanding what daily life aboard was actually like. The smell is not one smell. It is a layered, complex, historically specific combination of ingredients that no longer occurs anywhere in the modern world outside of a particularly dedicated museum reconstruction. Let me try to describe it to you, layer by layer. First, and most foundationally, there is the bilge. The bilge is the very lowest part of the ship, the narrow space at the absolute bottom of the hull between the inner lining and the outer planking, where water collects. On any wooden ship of this period, water always got in. It was inevitable. It seeped through the seams between planks, because wooden planks, however well fitted, were never perfectly watertight. It dripped down from wet sails and wet bodies and rain coming through open hatches. It ran down the inside of the hull when waves broke over the deck. And it pooled, always and continuously, in the lowest point of the ship, which was the bilge. And as it sat there over weeks and months at sea, it mixed with everything else that found its way down through the ship. Fragments of rotting food that had fallen through the gratings, waste that missed the designated bucket, dead rats and dead insects, rotting wood, cargo that had gone bad, remnants of whatever animal might have been kept aboard. The bilge on a working ship of the Golden Age was a black, viscous, shockingly pungent horror that needed to be pumped out regularly by the crew using large hand pumps on the deck. This pumping was a standard daily task, not because the bilge ever went away, but because if you let it accumulate too long it became unmanageable, and the smell became truly extraordinary, even by the standards of an environment where extraordinary smells were the baseline. the ship's carpenter monitored the rate at which water was accumulating in the bilge, because a sudden increase could mean the hull was leaking badly enough to be dangerous. Every sailor who ever wrote about life at sea mentioned the bilge. It features in memoirs and letters and official reports with a consistency and a descriptive intensity that suggests it was one of the most memorable aspects of the experience. Sailors who had been at sea for weeks no longer noticed it, because the human nose is remarkably adaptable and will eventually stop screaming about a smell it has decided is simply the permanent condition of the world. But anyone who stepped aboard a sailing ship for the first time was often physically sick within minutes, and this was a matter of routine note and no great sympathy from the experienced crew. Then there was the smell of the men themselves. Personal hygiene in the early 1700s was limited under the best circumstances, and at sea it was functionally non-existent in any meaningful sense. Fresh water was the most precious commodity on the ship. It was rationed carefully and counted obsessively because everyone's life depended on having enough of it for drinking and cooking, and there was essentially none left over for bathing. On a good day at sea in warm weather, a sailor might splash salt water on his face and hands. Ocean water does not actually clean things in the way fresh water does, and it leaves behind a residue of salt that itches and chafes on skin that is already roughened from rope and sun. On most days, the sailor did not even manage the salt water splash. 80 men living in a confined space, working hard with their bodies, sweating in tropical heat, sleeping in their clothes for weeks, producing the specific kind of deeply embedded dirt that comes from sustained physical labour and absolutely no bathing, generated a collective human aroma that was genuinely remarkable by any standard. Add to this the smell of tar and pine pitch. These substances were used constantly and extensively to waterproof the hull, to seal the seams between planks, to preserve ropes, to coat the rigging. The smell of warm tar in a tropical climate is not inherently unpleasant in small quantities. In the quantities that were applied to a working wooden ship, it became part of the permanent olfactory background in the way that certain neighbourhoods in industrial cities smell of whatever is made there. You just smell it all the time. Then there was the smell of gunpowder. A pirate ship carried a significant armament, and the powder and shot for those guns were stored in a magazine deep in the ship. But gunpowder in this era was not the modern stable compound we might imagine. It was volatile, it was smelly, and after any engagement in which the guns had been fired, the ship reeked of burnt powder in a way that did not dissipate quickly. The cook's galley produced its own contribution. The galley was a brick-lined firebox, usually built into the forward part of the ship below decks, where the ship's cook produced whatever he was going to produce for the day. We will discuss the food itself in detail shortly, but the smell of salt pork that has been boiling in an iron pot for several hours, combined with the salt water and the bilge and the men and the tar and the gunpowder, completed a bouquet that was truly singular in human experience. Prisoners taken by pirate crews sometimes wrote about the experience of being brought aboard a captured pirate vessel, and the accounts of the smell are remarkably consistent. One English merchant captain described being overpowered by the combined effluence of the hold almost immediately on boarding. Another described keeping his head turned toward the open sea as much as possible. These accounts were written by men who had themselves spent time at sea on merchant vessels, which suggests that the pirate ship was operating at a different order of magnitude even by the standards of the era. For the 80-plus men who lived aboard that ship every day, however, that smell was simply the smell of home, the smell of belonging, the smell of the world they knew. The human capacity for adaptation is one of the most genuinely extraordinary things about our species. Now, having given the smell the attention it deserves, let us look at the physical structure of the ship itself, because the space that the crew inhabited was as important as the smell in determining what life felt like. Your sloop is roughly 75 to 80 feet long. If you are in bed right now, or sitting in a room, try to estimate how many rooms of your current space would fit into 75 feet. A ship that size has to accommodate the hull structure itself, which takes up substantial space. the mast and its supporting structures going through the hull, the stores of food, water, ammunition, and supplies for a voyage of weeks or months, the ship's armament, which on a well-armed pirate sloop might be 8 to 16 guns. The ship's boat, usually a small wooden dinghy that was towed behind or stowed on deck. And her entire crew, all 80 of them, with everything they owned in the world, which was not much. The below-decks area of a sloop of this size was essentially one long, low-ceilinged room. The ceiling, which sailors call the overhead, was low enough that any person of average height had to stoop slightly to avoid hitting their head on the beams. Taller men, and some men of this era were considerably tall, learned very quickly to develop what was known as the sailor's stoop, a slight forward lean from the neck that became so habitual after weeks or months below decks that it followed them onto land, and was observable in the way experienced sailors moved even in buildings with perfectly adequate ceiling height. The light situation below decks deserves its own paragraph. In full daylight, with the ship in tropical sun, below decks on a sloop was a world of deep, dense shadow. The only natural light came through whatever hatches were open to the deck above, which was typically 2 or 3 at most, and through the gun ports when these were open. In any kind of bad weather, the hatches were battened shut, and the gun ports were closed, and below decks became the kind of darkness that modern people almost never experience. Not dim, not shadowy. Fully, completely, absolutely dark, in a way that modern electric light has made essentially unavailable outside of caves or specially constructed dark rooms. Navigation below decks was done by feel and memory. After a few weeks aboard, most sailors could move through the darkness with something like confidence, because they had learned the location of every beam and every obstruction and every step by the repeated experience of walking into them. At night, the available light sources were tallow candles and small oil lanterns, and these were regulated very strictly because fire on a wooden ship soaked in tar was not just a risk. It was an existential catastrophe that could destroy the ship and everyone aboard in minutes. Most captains, pirate captains included, limited the use of lights below decks after dark, which meant in practice that the off-watch crew went to bed when the sun went down. Not because they were particularly tired, although they usually were, simply because there was no practical alternative. Now, where did 80 men sleep on a ship 75 feet long? The answer is hammocks, and this answer turns out to be more interesting than it first appears. The hammock was adopted by European sailors from indigenous Caribbean peoples in the 16th century, and it was a genuinely revolutionary technology for sleeping at sea. Before the hammock, sailors slept on the bare deck or on whatever surface was available, which was rough on the body in the way that sleeping on a hard-moving platform tends to be. The hammock solved several problems simultaneously. It moved with the ship. When the vessel rolled, the hammock stayed level, held in place by the suspension from both ends, cradling the occupant in a way that a fixed surface could not. It could be rolled into a tight bundle during the day, clearing the living space for other activities. And that tight bundle could be stored in the ship's netting along the gunwales, where it provided a useful degree of protection against small arms fire in a battle, since rolled hammocks and blankets can stop a musket ball. Every hammock aboard had a hook at each end, and these hooks fitted into eyes set into the beams of the overhead, and the hammock hung between them, and that was your bed. The official regulation spacing, the written down, formally established, approved gap between one man's hammock and the next man's hammock was 14 inches. 14 inches. If you hold your hands about a foot and 2 fingers apart right now, that is the allowed space between the man sleeping to your left and the man sleeping to your right. On a fully crewed ship, even this minimal spacing was sometimes impossible. When the crew was at its largest, men slept in shifts. The off-watch crew, the half of the crew who were not currently on duty working the ship, would hang their hammocks and attempt to sleep. When their watch was over and the on-watch crew came below, the off-watch crew went up to take their positions, and the men who had just come off watch strung their hammocks in the same hooks and tried to sleep. The hammock you were sleeping in had been occupied by someone else just a few hours before. This thought requires a certain philosophical flexibility to make peace with, and experienced sailors made that peace because they had to, and because the hammock itself was warm and, relative to the floor, comfortable, and the ability to sleep was too valuable to sacrifice to squeamishness. There was no privacy on a pirate ship. None whatsoever. Not a corner of it, not a moment of it. The concept of private space simply did not apply. You ate, slept, argued, told stories, cried, got sick, recovered, had your drunken moments, had your quiet moments, got into fights, resolved those fights, did every single human thing a person does over the course of weeks and months, in a space that was permanently shared with dozens of other men who were doing the same things at the same time. Sailors who wrote about this afterward, in letters and journals and the occasional published memoir, did not generally describe the total absence of privacy as particularly distressing. They described it as simply the condition of the life, as unremarkable as the wind or the salt. What they valued in its place was what they called their mess, the small eating and social group within the larger crew, usually between 5 and 10 men who shared meals together, who looked out for each other in bad times, who formed the nucleus of loyalty and friendship that made the whole enterprise sustainable. Your mess was your family at sea. The ship's population included one more category of resident that I would be doing you a disservice to leave out, and that is the rats. Every wooden ship in this period had rats. Not a few. Not a manageable number that could be controlled with diligence and a good cat. A thriving, self-sustaining, well-established population of rats who regarded the ship as their domain and the humans as large. Clumsy, occasionally dangerous inconveniences who happened to store food in useful places. Rats got onto ships in port, hidden in cargo and food supplies and ropes and whatever else came aboard, and once aboard they were impossible to fully eliminate. They chewed into the food stores. They gnawed on ropes and wood. They fell into things and died in the walls where they could not be reached, adding a specific fragrant note to the ship's atmosphere at intervals. They bred. They multiplied. They made themselves comprehensively at home. Cats were kept aboard specifically to manage the rat population, and a good ship's cat, a hunter, a real worker, was a valued crew member in the most literal and practical sense. But the cats, however diligent, never won that war. The rats were simply too numerous, too fast, and too determined to maintain their position. What is interesting in historical accounts is that sailors developed something like a wary coexistence with the rats. Not affection, exactly, but a tolerance born of prolonged proximity and the recognition that the rats were simply a feature of the environment, as unavoidable as the creaking of the hull or the constant presence of salt water. Some sailors gave individual rats names. There are documented accounts of men gambling on rat races in the hold during particularly dull periods. The rats became, like the smell and the darkness and the cramped hammocks and the 14-inch spacing, simply part of what a ship was. Let us talk about the food, and I want to give this subject the careful attention it deserves, because the food situation on a pirate ship is one of the most critical and most consistently glossed over aspects of what daily life was actually like, and the reality of it goes a long way toward explaining things about these men that might otherwise be puzzling. The most important thing to understand about ship's food in the early 1700s is that it was not bad food that happened to be available on ships. It was food specifically and deliberately designed for ships. For the conditions of ships. For the demands of a long sea voyage where there would be no opportunity to obtain fresh supplies for weeks or months. And the design principle that governed all of it was, will it still be edible in 3 months? Not, is it delicious? Not is it nutritious in any sophisticated sense. Simply, will it still be edible? This principle, combined with the food preservation technology of the era, which was essentially salt and heat and drying, produced a diet that sustained human life over long periods at sea, while also being, by any honest modern assessment, genuinely difficult to eat. The foundational food of any sailing vessel was something called hardtack, or ship's biscuit. Hardtack was made from flour, water and salt, mixed into a stiff dough and baked at a high temperature for a very long time. The goal of this baking was to remove every trace of moisture from the final product, because moisture meant mould, and mould meant the biscuit would begin to rot within days of leaving port. The result of this process was a dense, pale, nearly indestructible disc that was roughly the size of a large cookie, about half an inch thick, and so hard that biting directly into it was genuinely risky for anyone who valued their teeth. The standard approaches were to soak it in water or some other liquid before eating, to break it into pieces and drop those pieces into whatever hot liquid was being served that day, or to gnaw carefully at the edges while working one's way inward. Hardtack could last for years if kept dry. There are documented instances of sailors eating hardtack biscuits that were literally years old, found in stores that had been set aside and forgotten. Whether they tasted appreciably different from fresh hardtack is an open question. The biscuit itself had very little flavour at any age, being essentially a delivery mechanism for the caloric content of the flour, rather than anything one would describe as pleasurable to eat. Now here is the aspect of the hardtack situation that every sailor knew, and that requires you to set aside any remaining romantic notions about the simplicity of life at sea. After roughly 2 to 3 weeks out of port, depending on conditions, the hardtack developed weevils. Weevils are small beetles, perhaps 3 or 4 millimeters in length, dark brown, almost black, and they were capable of working their way into the hardtack through tiny imperfections and laying eggs in the interior, and their larvae would hatch and live there, tunneling minute channels through the biscuit that you could sometimes see from the outside and sometimes could not. The experienced sailor had 2 documented strategies for this situation. Strategy 1, which was considered the somewhat more fastidious approach, was to hold the biscuit over the side of the ship or over a dark surface and tap it sharply before eating. This caused many of the weevils and their larvae to fall out, and you then ate the biscuit. Strategy 2, which was preferred by many veterans, was to eat the biscuit in the dark, or at least without looking at it too closely, because what you could not see was much easier to not think about. And some sailors, displaying a pragmatism that is genuinely impressive, pointed out that the weevils and their larvae were a source of protein in a diet that was often desperately short of it. This is historically accurate. This is not embellishment. The weevil was a nutritional supplement. Whether this information makes you feel better or worse about the situation, I honestly cannot determine. Alongside the hardtack, the main source of protein and caloric substance was salted meat. This came primarily in the form of salt beef and salt pork, packed into large wooden barrels in alternating layers of meat and coarse salt, sometimes also preserved in brine. The process of salt preservation was effective. It kept the meat technically edible for 6 months or more, which was its entire purpose. But the effect of months in a barrel of salt on beef or pork is profound and not flattering. The meat that emerged after several months was stiff, extremely fibrous, a greyish-brown colour that did not invite close inspection, and aggressively, ferociously, almost aggressively salty. The standard preparation was boiling, which softened the texture somewhat and drew out some of the salt, and which produced a broth that could be eaten with the hardtack or on its own. The boiling also produced a distinctive smell throughout the ship, the smell of very old salt pork being very earnestly encouraged to become food. That was part of the daily olfactory landscape, in a way sailors barely registered, but which was formidable to anyone encountering it fresh. Dried peas and beans were also standard provisions. They kept well in dry storage for months, they could be boiled into a porridge or soup that was at least warm and filling, and they provided some variation in the daily diet that was otherwise at serious risk of becoming entirely monotonous. Occasionally, in the early weeks of a voyage before all the fresh provisions ran out, there were onions and other root vegetables, and occasionally dried fruits, and these were treated with the appreciation that their rarity deserved. Vinegar was part of the standard stores, used both as a flavouring agent and as a rudimentary preservative and disinfectant. And there was rum. There was always rum. The rum of the early 1700s Caribbean was a different product from what fills modern bottles. It was produced in enormous quantities from the waste products of sugar manufacturing, primarily molasses, and it was cheap, rough and powerful. In the Caribbean world of the early 18th century, rum was literally cheaper than clean water. It was issued as a standard daily ration on most ships, typically somewhere around half a pint to a pint per man per day, depending on the captain and the available supply. This is more rum than most modern people drink in a week, consumed as part of the daily routine, in the way one might now drink coffee or tea. The reasons for the rum ration were partly practical, because rum mixed into questionable water killed at least some of what was living in that water, and partly social, because keeping the crew adequately supplied with spirits was a proven method of maintaining something like morale in an environment that was otherwise fairly effective at eroding it. The cook in this world occupied a peculiar and interesting social position. On most ships of this era, the cook was not someone who had been trained in the culinary arts. The cook was typically whoever was available, and whoever could not perform the more physically demanding duties of seamanship, and since the physically most demanding work involved climbing rigging and hauling heavy ropes and managing sails in bad weather, the cook was very often someone who had lost a limb and could not safely do those things. An amputee, particularly someone who had lost a leg, could stand at a galley stove and stir things and manage a fire perfectly well. So the pirate ship's cook was frequently a one-legged man who had arrived at his position through injury, and who wielded an extraordinary and entirely informal power over the mood and cohesion of the entire crew, based simply on whether what came out of his galley was warm and filling and reasonably varied, or whether it was uniformly terrible. A good cook could take salt pork, dried peas, hardtack biscuit, and whatever incidental ingredients were available, and produce something that was at least warm and comforting and slightly different from what was served yesterday. A bad cook could take those same ingredients and turn them into something that made the rats look like a viable dietary option. The cook held no rank. He was not an officer in any formal sense. But he was never last in the rum queue, and he was rarely the target of anyone's aggressions if he could help it, and this informal protection was entirely understood and broadly respected. What mealtimes actually looked like aboard a pirate ship is worth describing in some detail, because the ritual of eating together was one of the few genuine daily structures that gave shape to otherwise formless days. Meals were eaten in messes, those small social groups of 5 to 10 men. Each mess had a wooden bowl, sometimes a single bowl shared between several men, and a spoon. Forks were not yet common items in the world of ordinary working people in the early 1700s. You ate with a spoon and with your hands, and with whatever piece of hardtack you could use as an improvised scooping implement. The food was served from a communal pot into the communal bowl, and the men of the mess ate from it together or passed it between themselves in a sequence that reflected the informal social hierarchies of the group. Mealtime was social time in the fullest sense. It was the designated moment for conversation and story and argument. It was when news and rumours moved through the crew, when grievances were aired, when plans were made, when friendships were maintained and grudges were renewed. On a ship that had no other scheduled social activities and no private spaces, the meals were the formal communal moments, the points of the day when everyone was doing the same thing at the same time for the same purpose. There were typically 2 main meals a day, one in the late morning and one in the late afternoon, with the rum ration distributed at both. The specific timing of meals was less fixed than the modern convention of 3 meals at specific clock hours, because of course, most crew members did not have personal clocks or watches. Time at sea was tracked by the watch system, with the day divided into watch periods, and meal timing was organised around the watch changes rather than around any fixed hour. What happened when a pirate ship captured a vessel with well-stocked provisions is worth lingering over, because the contrast between the captured stores and the ship's regular diet was so stark as to be practically emotional. Imagine eating hardtack and salt pork for 6 weeks. Then imagine being among the first to go into the galley of a recently captured merchant ship and finding fresh bread, baked just that morning, cheese that had actual flavour, smoked fish that had been prepared within the week, onions, possibly limes or oranges, possibly preserved meats of a quality that bore no resemblance to the ancient salt beef in the barrels. The accounts of pirate crews after successful captures consistently reflect an immediate and practical focus on the food supplies of the captured vessel before anything else, including any more conventionally valuable cargo. The fresh food was consumed quickly, usually within a day or two, before it could go bad. It was eaten with a gratitude that the people who provisioned that ship could never have imagined they were creating. Then, there was scurvy. Scurvy is one of those historical phenomena that most people have a general awareness of, associating it vaguely with sailors and lime juice and missing teeth, without really understanding what it is or what it actually did to a human body over the course of weeks and months. Scurvy is caused by a severe and prolonged deficiency of vitamin C. Human beings, unlike most other mammals, cannot synthesize their own vitamin C. We must obtain it from our food. Specifically from fresh fruits and vegetables primarily, and fresh fruits and vegetables, while available in port, were essentially unavailable at sea after the first week or so, because nothing fresh lasted on a ship in tropical heat without refrigeration. What happens to a human body when it is denied vitamin C for 3 or 4 months, or sometimes less in particularly vulnerable individuals, is a process that begins quietly and escalates. The body's ability to produce collagen, the structural protein that holds so many of our tissues together, begins to fail. Collagen is what gives skin its integrity. It is a structural component of blood vessels. It maintains the connections between bones and keeps old healed wounds from reopening. Without it, things literally begin to come apart. The first signs of scurvy were insidious because they could so easily be attributed to other causes. General fatigue and low mood were prominent early symptoms, which were, in the context of life on a cramped ship on a long voyage, so unremarkable that they were easily dismissed. Then the gums began to swell and to bleed. The teeth loosened in their sockets. The skin became extraordinarily tender, bruising at the slightest contact. Old healed wounds that might have closed and scarred years before, began to break open again as the connective tissue that held them together failed. Joints ached. The entire body seemed to be protesting at the molecular level. In severe cases, as the deficiency progressed without treatment, a man could become unable to stand, unable to work, racked with pain, covered in spontaneous hemorrhages under the skin that turned his flesh purple and black in great spreading patches. And eventually, he would die. This could happen over the course of weeks from an already nutritionally compromised baseline, or over months in someone who had been in reasonable health. The tragedy of scurvy, understood from our current perspective, is that the cure was so simple and so available. Citrus fruit, fresh or even preserved, taken in small amounts regularly, prevented it entirely. This was known, in a rough empirical way, by some ships' captains who had noticed the correlation between ships that carried citrus fruit and ships that had healthy crews, without understanding the underlying mechanism. But this practical knowledge was not universal. It was not implemented systematically, and the full scientific explanation would not come until later in the 18th century. In the meantime, scurvy killed an enormous number of sailors on every nation's ships, including pirates, and it shaped the patterns of pirate raiding in ways that are not immediately obvious. You raided merchant ships not only for their gold and silver and cargo, you raided them for their fresh provisions. A captured ship's galley, stocked with dried fruits and fresh vegetables and possibly some citrus, was in certain circumstances more valuable to a pirate crew than any amount of coin. The water situation deserves its own treatment, because clean drinking water was, in many ways, the single most precious thing on any ship. It was carried in large wooden casks stored in the hold, carefully counted, carefully rationed, with each man receiving a fixed daily allowance and no more. The problem was what happened to water stored in a wooden cask over the course of weeks and months at sea in a warm climate. Wooden casks were not airtight. They were not completely impermeable. Slowly, over time, water stored in them was subject to contamination. Algae grew in the warm conditions. Bacteria multiplied. The wood itself contributed compounds to the water. After 6 or 8 weeks, the water in the casks was green or brownish, foul-smelling and of very doubtful safety. It was, nonetheless, the water you had, and you drank it, because the alternative was dying of thirst. The practice of mixing the water with rum served the dual purpose of making it easier to drink and killing at least some of what was living in it, which is a genuinely ingenious piece of empirical public health for an era that had no germ theory. Now here is one of the most genuinely surprising things about pirate ships in the Golden Age of Piracy, and it is something that almost no one outside of maritime historians knows, and which you will probably find yourself wanting to tell people about. Pirate ships were, by the standards of the early 18th century, remarkably democratic institutions, and I do not mean that loosely or poetically or as a kind of metaphor. I mean it in an almost technical and quite literal sense. Before a pirate crew set sail, before they even left the harbour, they drew up a document called the Articles of Agreement. Sometimes it was called the Code, or simply the Articles. This document, which every member of the crew signed or marked with an X if they could not write, and literacy rates in this world were not high, laid out the rules of the ship in explicit detail. It covered the distribution of plunder, the compensation for injuries, the resolution of disputes, the punishment for violations, the authority of the captain and its limits, the rights of each individual crew member, and a range of other specific matters that varied from ship to ship. And if you actually read the surviving examples of these articles, and historians have found several, what you discover is that they contain provisions that were more equitable, more transparent, and more explicit about the rights of individual working men than almost anything in the official legal frameworks of the early 18th century. Think about that for a moment. A group of men who were technically criminals, operating outside the law, in a world that offered them no legal protections whatsoever, had created their own legal framework, and that framework was in many ways more fair to ordinary working men than the legitimate legal systems around them. The captain of a pirate ship was elected by the crew. He served at the crew's pleasure. If the men decided, by majority vote, that the captain was making bad decisions, or was treating the crew unjustly, or was leading them toward poor targets, they could vote to remove him and elect someone else. This happened. It was not just a theoretical possibility, but a practical reality that multiple documented pirate captains experienced. During a battle, the captain's authority was essentially total, because combat required immediate clear decisions and could not wait for a committee meeting. But outside of active fighting, the captain was something more like a democratically accountable executive than an absolute authority. His word was not final on most matters. His actions were subject to review. The quartermaster, who on a pirate ship was a very different role from the same title in any other context, was the crew's elected representative. The quartermaster was chosen by the crew to serve as a check on the captain's power. He handled the distribution of plunder, ensuring that every man received his correct share under the articles. He settled disputes between crew members. He could override the captain on matters that fell outside of battle. He reported to the crew rather than to the captain. This separation of powers, this deliberate construction of a system where authority was divided and accountable, was genuinely sophisticated political thinking embedded in the operating structure of a pirate ship. Bartholomew Roberts, who was the most prolific pirate of the Golden Age by any measurable standard, and who we will discuss in more detail later, had articles that have been preserved by historians, and which are worth looking at in some detail, because they illustrate how thorough these systems could be. Roberts' articles specified that every man had an equal vote in all decisions and equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors taken as prizes, except in cases of scarcity, in which case they were to be rationed equitably. Every man was entitled to be called to counsel on any matter of significance. Any person who kept a secret from the rest of the company to the detriment of the common interest was to suffer whatever punishment the majority saw fit. No person was to game at cards or dice for money. This provision about gambling is interesting precisely because it was necessary, because gambling was clearly endemic and clearly caused enough conflict to require prohibition. Lights and candles were to be put out at 8 o'clock in the evening, and any of the crew still desirous of drinking after that hour were to do so on the open deck. No boy or woman was to be allowed amongst them. Deserting the ship or quarters in battle was to be punished by death or by marooning. No striking one another on board the ship, with all quarrels to be settled on shore by sword and pistol, in a formal manner and witnessed. And then the compensation provisions, which are the most remarkable part. Any man who lost a limb or became a cripple in the common service of the company was to have 800 pieces of 8 from the common stock. This was, in effect, a disability insurance policy, written down and agreed upon by the collective, implemented through a common fund drawn from shared plunder, providing specified payments for specified injuries. In 1710, at a time when the Royal Navy, the legal arm of the British Crown, provided no compensation whatsoever for injured sailors beyond a theoretical and very uncertain claim on the charitable institution of Greenwich Hospital. The contrast between life on a pirate ship and life on a Royal Navy warship of the same period is stark enough to be worth dwelling on, because it helps explain something that would otherwise be puzzling, which is why so many trained and experienced sailors chose piracy over legitimate employment. On a Royal Navy warship, the captain had virtually absolute authority over every man aboard. He could order flogging for almost any offence. Flogging meant being tied to a frame and struck across the bare back with a cat o' nine tails, a multi-tailed whip designed to inflict maximum damage with each stroke. The standard punishment for moderate offences was 12 lashes. For serious offences it could be dozens more, enough to leave permanent scarring and to cause shock and blood loss. The captain decided the punishment, and the captain's decision was final. Navy pay was chronically in arrears. Sailors who had served for years could be owed months of back pay, with no clear mechanism for actually collecting it. Discharge from service was at the Navy's discretion, and men who had completed their terms sometimes waited months or years to be formally released because the Navy was reluctant to lose trained men. Fresh provisions on Navy ships were not appreciably better than on other ships, and the management of food stores was subject to the same corruption and mismanagement that characterised most institutional provisioning of the era. Given these conditions, the Articles of Agreement look very different. They look like a rational response to an unjust set of alternatives. They look like men who had experienced one set of conditions and decided, with some clarity, that they could do better. The punishment provisions of pirate articles were, within their own framework, regulated and proportionate in ways that Navy punishment was not. Serious violations brought serious consequences. Stealing from a fellow crew member was punished by marooning, which meant being left on a very small island or sandbar with a pistol and a small supply of water and powder. The pistol was provided for two purposes. 1, so that you might signal rescue ships if any happened to pass. 2, so that if rescue did not come and you faced death from exposure and thirst, you had the option to spare yourself a slower ending. This punishment was genuinely harsh, but it was a specified punishment for a specified offence, applied through a process, not the arbitrary decision of one man in a position of unaccountable power. The Moses' Law punishment of 39 lashes, the maximum prescribed under biblical law that some pirate articles drew on, was reserved for specific serious offences and was applied by the crew collectively rather than by an individual officer exercising personal discretion. A captain who abused his authority, who treated crew members arbitrarily or unfairly, who kept information from the company or gave himself privileges the articles did not grant, faced the very real possibility of being voted out. The process by which a new crew member joined a pirate ship and formally agreed to the articles is interesting in itself. When a new recruit was brought aboard, either because they had sought out the crew voluntarily or because they had been given the choice after a capture, the articles were read aloud to them in their entirety. Literacy was not universal, and the crew's articles were read to ensure everyone had heard and understood every provision before being asked to commit to them. This reading was a formal event. It was done in front of the assembled crew. The new recruit was then asked whether they understood the articles and whether they agreed to serve under them. If they agreed, They signed or marked an X next to their name, and that signature or mark was the evidence of their commitment. Deserters from Articles-bound crews were occasionally caught in port towns and returned to the ship, where the process of dealing with them was governed by the Articles themselves rather than by any individual officer's discretion. The transparency of the Articles extended to the distribution of plunder, which was handled with a formality that the casual romanticism of pirate stories rarely conveys. After a successful capture, the prize and its contents were assessed by the quartermaster and a committee of crew members. The value of the take was estimated, sometimes quite crudely given the limitations of the assessment available. Certain items were set aside as the common stock, funding the ship's ongoing operation, repairs, and the compensation fund for injured crew members specified in the Articles. The remainder was divided according to the share system, with the captain receiving 1.5 or 2 shares, the quartermaster and other senior men receiving slightly more than an ordinary share, and every common crew member receiving 1 full share. This was considerably more equitable than any legitimate maritime employment of the period. A merchant sailor had no share of the cargo he transported. A navy sailor had no share of prizes taken by his ship beyond a small formal acknowledgement. A pirate received a direct and specified portion of every successful operation, and that portion was determined in advance and was not subject to reduction at anyone's discretion. There is a telling story in the historical record about a pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold, who refused to attack English ships because of some persisting patriotic attachment to England, even while conducting piracy in every other direction. His crew voted on the matter, and they voted to remove him. There was no violence, no drama. They simply voted. Hornigold stepped down and was replaced. This is how it worked. The crew were the ultimate authority, and they exercised that authority as a matter of routine practice. The distribution of authority on pirate ships extended to the management of prizes and captives in ways that further illustrate how thoroughly the model differed from any conventional maritime employment. When a prize was taken, the quartermaster was responsible for the initial inventory and assessment of the captured vessel and its cargo. He led the boarding party that went through the prize methodically, cataloguing what was there and assessing its value. He was the one who spoke with the surviving crew of the captured ship, hearing their account of the voyage and the cargo and the circumstances of the capture. He determined, in consultation with the captain and with reference to the Articles, what would be taken and what would be left. He oversaw the actual transfer of goods from the prize to the pirate vessel, and he maintained the record of the total take, against which the share distribution at the end of the voyage would be calculated. This was significant administrative responsibility, and the men who served as quartermaster on successful pirate ships were often genuinely talented administrators as well as capable sailors. The role demanded the ability to keep accurate accounts in conditions that made accurate accounting difficult, the ability to manage the competing claims of crew members who felt they deserved more than the Articles allocated, and the ability to maintain the respect of the crew while performing functions that inevitably made someone unhappy. A quartermaster who lost the confidence of the crew was replaced. A quartermaster who earned and maintained that confidence was one of the most influential people aboard the ship, arguably more practically influential on a day-to-day basis than the captain himself. The relationship between captain and quartermaster on a well-functioning pirate ship was often described in the records as a kind of partnership, with the captain providing the leadership and vision and the quartermaster providing the operational management and the crew relations. When this relationship worked well, the ship ran smoothly and the crew operated as a coherent unit. When it broke down through personal conflict or through disagreement about fundamental direction, the result was usually a vote that replaced one or both of them. Now let us talk about what everyone always wants to know about first when the subject of pirates comes up, which is the fighting. The battles. The cannon fire and the smoke and the boarding and the cutlasses glinting in the Caribbean sun. And I want to tell you something right at the beginning that will sound initially like I am taking all the drama away, but which turns out to be one of the most interesting truths about piracy in the Golden Age. Most pirates, most of the time, very urgently, with great commitment and profound personal investment, wanted to avoid fighting. This is not cowardice. This is arithmetic. Think about it from the perspective of someone running a maritime commercial enterprise, which is what piracy fundamentally was. If you blast a merchant ship with your cannons, you have damaged or destroyed the thing you wanted to steal. If the merchant crew fights back and kills some of your men, those are men you cannot replace in the middle of the ocean, and they were men who knew the ship and knew each other and knew the articles. If a cannonball takes down your own mast, your ability to maneuver is crippled, and you are now vulnerable to anyone who happens along. If the fight goes badly, and you are captured or killed, the enterprise ends. Violence was expensive. Violence was risky. Violence was bad for business in ways that made pirates genuinely motivated to find alternatives to it wherever possible. What pirates used instead of violence, as a first resort, was psychology. They used theatre. They used the reputation of piracy itself as an instrument of coercion, and they wielded it with a sophistication that historians have studied and appreciated for decades. The Jolly Roger, that famous skull and crossbones flag that has become the iconic symbol of piracy, was not primarily designed to terrify, it was designed to communicate. It was a signal with a specific and quite legible meaning, and that meaning was not simply "we are dangerous." The meaning was more precise than that. The meaning was, "we are pirates. We know who we are. You know who we are. We will not kill you if you surrender now and cooperate with us. If you force us to fight, we will not feel constrained by any particular mercy afterward, and we have the means to make that unpleasant." This was a rough offer, but it was an offer. A genuine choice being extended to the master of the ship, whose horizon was suddenly filled with an approaching vessel flying a skull and crossbones. Many pirate crews used a specific sequence of flags to communicate with potential targets. They might approach flying a neutral flag, or even a national flag that corresponded to the target ship's own nation, getting close enough to make escape difficult or impossible. Then, at the critical moment, when the geometry of the situation made resistance more dangerous than cooperation, they would run up the Jolly Roger, and in the majority of cases the merchant vessel would comply. The merchant crew were not soldiers. They were working sailors, professionals employed to move cargo from one port to another for wages. They had no significant personal interest in the cargo they were carrying. They had every significant personal interest in not dying. If surrender meant survival, surrender was the rational choice, and most of them made it. The specific design of the Jolly Roger varied considerably from captain to captain, which is something that gets lost in the standardized version that popular culture has settled on. Blackbeard flew a flag that depicted a horned skeleton holding an hourglass and a spear, with a heart dripping 3 drops of blood. Bartholomew Roberts flew a design showing a pirate standing with one foot on a skull, accompanied by an hourglass and crossbones. Calico Jack Rackham flew skulls and crossed swords rather than crossed bones. Each design was a personal brand, a specific visual identity that experienced sailors in the Caribbean could read and recognize. There was also a specific variation that carried a more extreme message. A red flag, rather than a black one, traditionally signaled that the pirates were offering no quarter, no mercy, no possibility of surrender. This flag was used when the pirates had a specific reason to want to inflict damage rather than simply take a prize, or when a target had already refused the offer of the black flag and forced a fight. The distinction between the two flags was understood throughout the maritime community of the Caribbean. They were part of a recognized language of threat and offer. When fighting actually did occur, the reality was nothing like the choreographed elegance of film. A cannon battle at sea in the early 1700s began with the broadside, the simultaneous firing of all the guns on one side of a ship. And the sound of a broadside at close range was physically overwhelming in a way that is very difficult to convey to modern ears. It was not simply very loud, it was a concussive physical event. The pressure wave of 8 or 12 guns firing simultaneously struck the chest and the face and the ears in a way that was stunning. Ears rang for hours afterward, and the men who served guns through years of these engagements often developed significant and permanent hearing loss that they wore as an occupational feature of the work. The smoke from black powder cannon fire was immediately enormous. Within seconds of a first broadside, a white cloud of smoke had enveloped the deck and the water surface around the ship, and within a minute or two of continuous fire, the visibility was essentially zero. Men were fighting in a world of noise and white smoke and the smell of burning and the constant roar of guns that they could see no more than a few feet through. A cannonball striking a wooden hull did not create a neat round hole and continue on its way. The ball transferred its energy to the wood it struck, and the wood responded by exploding outward and inward in a spray of fragments. High-velocity wooden splinters, ranging in size from tiny slivers to pieces the length of a man's forearm and as thick as a finger, travelled outward from the impact point in every direction. These splinters were the primary cause of casualties in naval combat of this era, not the cannonballs themselves. A man could be struck by a splinter while standing 20 feet from the point of impact. The splinters entered flesh and lodged there, and the removal of wooden splinters from wounds was one of the most demanding tasks of the ship's surgeon after a battle. When the cannon fire had done its work, or when the ships were too close for cannon to be effectively deployed, came the boarding. Grappling hooks on ropes were thrown across the gap between ships to bring the two vessels together. Men crossed on planks laid between the gunwales, or in small boats, or sometimes simply jumped the gap when it was narrow enough. The men boarding were armed with whatever was at hand: pistols, cutlasses, axes, boarding pikes, belaying pins used as clubs. The pistol of this era was a single-shot weapon. Once fired, it was empty, and reloading in the middle of a boarding action was essentially impossible. Most men who boarded therefore carried multiple pistols, sometimes 3 or 4, tucked into belts and into the fronts of their jackets, fired one and moved to the next. When all the pistols were empty, the pistol became a club, and then you relied on the cutlass. The cutlass is not a refined weapon. It is a short, curved, single-edged blade designed specifically for the confined spaces and close quarters fighting of shipboard combat, where the thrusting techniques of formal sword fighting were largely impractical. It was made to hack and slash in tight spaces, and it was wielded with aggression rather than elegance. Every person who survived a boarding action and wrote about it later described not a glorious adventure, but a frightening chaos in which you focused very narrowly on whatever was immediately in front of you and did everything you could not to die. The aftermath of serious fighting fell most heavily on the ship's surgeon, who was one of the most important people aboard any vessel, and who in the aftermath of a battle had more work than any single person could comfortably manage. Surgery in 1710 bore almost no relationship to what we would recognise as medicine, even crude medicine. The surgeon's primary and most frequently needed skill was amputation. Damaged limbs, in an era without antibiotics, without any effective means of treating infection, without even a basic understanding of what caused infection, were routinely fatal if left in place. The infection that set into a bad wound, left untreated in the conditions of a ship at sea, could kill a man who had survived the wound itself within days. Removing the limb promptly, before the infection could spread, was sometimes the only way to save the patient's life. These amputations were performed without anaesthesia in any modern sense of the word. Rum in large quantities was the available alternative. The patient was held down by several strong men. The surgeon worked as fast as he possibly could, using a bone saw and knives that he kept sharp because speed was essential, and a dull blade made the procedure longer and the outcome worse. The stump was then cauterized, burning the wound closed to control bleeding, and dressed as well as the available materials permitted. The men who survived this procedure, and many did, demonstrated a toughness that is genuinely striking, even accounting for the fact that they had no choice but to endure what was being done to them. Their subsequent recovery, in a ship with no sterile conditions, no antibiotics, limited fresh water, and food that was unlikely to support healing in any sophisticated nutritional sense, was a matter that owed as much to luck and constitution as to any medical care they received. What is perhaps most striking when you read the accounts of people who survived significant naval engagements in this period is the matter-of-factness with which they describe experiences that to modern sensibilities seem extraordinary in their horror. The men who served aboard these ships had a different relationship to violence and to physical suffering than most people in the developed world have today. They lived closer to the reality of the body's vulnerability and the body's resilience than contemporary experience generally allows. They had seen animals slaughtered. They had seen people die of illness and accident. The hospital, where such a thing existed in the early 18th century, was not a place that kept death at a comfortable distance, but a place where death and survival happened in close proximity. The pirate who came through a serious engagement and wrote about it later was not writing about something that he experienced as uniquely traumatic in the sense we might use that word today, though it was certainly frightening and certainly painful. He was writing about something that was within the range of experiences his world had prepared him to have. This is not to suggest that men in this era did not suffer psychologically from violence and loss. They clearly did. The superstitions, the drinking, the intensity of the mess group bonds, all of these were coping mechanisms as much as cultural practices. But the framework within which they processed these experiences was different from ours, and understanding that difference is part of understanding what it meant to actually be in this world rather than to observe it from a comfortable distance. The decision to fight, when fighting became unavoidable, was made with a clarity that came from having no other option. The decision to fight well, to maintain position and courage and effectiveness in conditions designed to produce panic and confusion, was a test of character that the men involved met with varying degrees of success. Some were formidable fighters who became effective and even confident in the chaos of combat. Others discovered under fire that they were less effective than they had imagined themselves to be in the hypothetical. Both kinds of men were present on every ship, and both kinds were usually still there for the next engagement, because deserting your position in a fight was one of the specific offences for which the articles prescribed the most severe punishment. Here is something that the mythology of piracy almost systematically obscures, because it does not make a good story. The most dangerous things on a pirate ship were not enemy cannon fire, not rival sailors with cutlasses, not storms, not even the food and water, though all of those were genuine and serious threats. The most dangerous things were microscopic. They were the diseases that moved through the confined, unsanitary, warm and humid environment of a wooden ship with a crew of 80 men, moving with the invisible efficiency of pathogens that had no idea they were killing people, and would not have cared if they did. If you look at historical records from the Golden Age of Piracy and actually study what killed the men involved, the answer is disease, by a margin that is not even close. Disease accounted for more deaths than all the battles and executions and storms combined, and understanding this changes the picture of what pirate life was fundamentally like. Scurvy we have already covered in detail, but it was by no means the only significant disease in this world, and in some ways it was not even the most immediately dangerous, because at least it developed relatively slowly and gave the body time to respond if treatment arrived. Dysentery was arguably more immediately threatening, because it struck fast and could kill fast. Dysentery is a bacterial infection of the intestines, spread through contaminated food and water and through the fecal-oral route that is extremely difficult to avoid in conditions where hygiene was limited and where 100 men were sharing the same basic sanitary facilities and the same food preparation environment. Its primary symptom is severe, prolonged bloody diarrhea accompanied by cramps and fever. In the modern world with oral rehydration therapy and antibiotics, dysentery is treatable and rarely fatal. In the Golden Age of Piracy, without either of those things, dysentery killed by dehydration. The body was losing fluid faster than it could take in fluid, in conditions where fresh water was already strictly rationed, and the outcome was the progressive shutdown of the body that accompanies severe dehydration. This was a particularly cruel way to die at sea, surrounded by salt water but unable to drink it, with the fresh water supply rationed and insufficient to compensate for what was being lost. Outbreaks of dysentery moved through a ship's crew with terrible speed because of the close quarters and the shared food supply and water supply, and a single outbreak could incapacitate a significant fraction of the crew at once. Malaria was a major and persistent killer in the Caribbean and in the tropical waters of the Indian Ocean, which was another significant zone of pirate activity in the early 18th century. The Caribbean in 1710 was an endemic malaria zone. The specific mechanism of transmission, the Anopheles mosquito carrying the Plasmodium parasite, would not be understood until the very end of the 19th century. But the disease itself was undeniable and omnipresent. Its cycle of high fevers, chills, sweating, severe muscle pain, and profound exhaustion, followed by a brief recovery and then the return of the same cycle, debilitated men for weeks and months and gradually destroyed red blood cells in ways that left survivors weakened and vulnerable for long periods. Men who contracted malaria in the Caribbean and survived the acute phase often carried it with them for years, with recurring attacks triggered by stress or illness or exposure to cold. Yellow fever struck periodically and with devastating speed. Unlike malaria, yellow fever was not a chronic background condition. It was an outbreak disease, appearing in port towns or aboard ships, and killing a significant percentage of those it infected within a week of the first symptoms. The jaundice, the internal bleeding, the final stages of organ failure that characterized severe yellow fever were terrifying to witness in someone you had been working alongside just days before. Typhus, spread by lice and fleas in conditions of close quarters and limited hygiene, was another consistent killer. The experience of caring for a seriously ill crewmate in these conditions was one of the defining tests of the bonds that formed between men aboard a ship. Your mess was your family, and when one of your mess fell ill, the others took on the nursing duties that the ship's surgeon, even when one was present, could not provide around the clock. This meant sitting with a delirious man in a hot, dark, moving environment while trying to get him to drink the precious and limited water. It meant cleaning up after him when dysentery made the bodily realities of illness impossible to manage. It meant staying with him when the fevers were at their worst and he was talking to people who were not there. It meant the quiet, practical, unglamorous work of care that has been performed by ordinary people for their friends and family in difficult circumstances throughout human history, and that almost never makes it into the stories we tell about that history. The surgeon, where one existed, was a fascinating figure in this world. Surgeons at sea occupied a peculiar social position. They were educated men in an otherwise not particularly educated environment. They had undergone some formal training, however limited by modern standards, and they possessed a kit of instruments and a supply of medicines that distinguished them physically from everyone else aboard. They were paid more than ordinary crew members and occupied a slightly different social position, but the knowledge they brought was incomplete and in some cases actively harmful, and they knew this. At least the thoughtful ones did. A ship's surgeon who was honest with himself about the limits of his knowledge in 1710 was someone dealing with the fundamental human challenge of needing to do something in the face of suffering when what was available to be done was inadequate to the scale of what was wrong. The ship's surgeon's kit typically included a variety of knives and saws for surgical procedures, forceps and probes for removing foreign objects from wounds, needles and thread for suturing, various herbal medicines of variable actual efficacy, including opium-derived preparations that could at least reduce pain somewhat, a tourniquet, splints for broken bones, and a range of other items that reflected the medical thinking of the era, some of which was correct and much of which was not. Bloodletting, the practice of removing blood from the patient as a treatment for fever, was standard medical practice of the period, and was genuinely counterproductive, as we understand now, reducing the body's ability to fight infection by lowering blood volume and compromising the immune system. Herbal preparations varied from genuinely effective traditional remedies whose efficacy was empirically established, if not scientifically understood, to elaborate preparations based on theories of health that had no factual basis. The doctor did what he knew how to do. Sometimes that helped, and sometimes it did not. And the surgeon was himself not immune to the diseases he was treating. which meant that at the moments when a crew most needed his services, he might himself be among those laid low. When a ship's surgeon died or became incapacitated, the crew managed without professional medical care, which in practice meant they managed as they always had, through the nursing care of messmates, through the limited pharmacopoeia of whatever herbal medicines were in the surgeon's kit, and through the fundamental human tendency to either survive or not survive based primarily on the severity of what was afflicting you and the particular characteristics of your immune system. The collective biological warfare that these pathogens waged on ships' crews was made more effective by the conditions of the ship itself. Close quarters meant that whatever was in the lungs of one man reached the lungs of the men sleeping 14 inches away from him that night. Shared water casks meant that whatever was in the intestines of one man could reach the intestines of the entire crew through the water supply. The lack of washing meant that lice and fleas moved freely from one body to another. The warm and humid climate that made the Caribbean so beautiful to look at was also a nearly perfect environment for the propagation of the things that were trying to kill everyone aboard the ship. The ship's surgeon, where one existed, was working at the limits of 18th century medical understanding. He knew how to amputate. He knew how to set bones. He knew how to sew wounds closed. He knew how to let blood, which was the standard treatment of the era for fevers, and which actually worsened the condition of the patient by reducing blood volume and therefore the body's ability to fight infection. He did not know about bacteria or viruses or the germ theory of disease. He could not have known. This information would not exist for another 150 years. What he could do was provide physical care, some herbal medicines of varying actual efficacy, and company. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the patient's own immune system did what no medicine of the era could assist. Sometimes it was not enough, and the man died, and the ceremony that followed was brief and practical and moving in its simplicity. A man who died at sea was wrapped in his hammock. The last stitch of the wrapping was traditionally put through the nose, partly as a final verification that the man was truly dead, and partly simply as the custom it had always been. A cannonball was placed at the feet to ensure the body sank, rather than floating and becoming an extended and distressing reminder of mortality. The captain or someone literate said whatever words seemed right. The body was committed to the deep. And then life continued, because it had to. The psychological toll of watching crewmates die in these ways, slowly and badly, and in close quarters where there was no possible privacy and no escape from witnessing, was something that sailors of this era generally did not write about in direct terms. The culture did not provide the vocabulary for it. But it was there. It was present in the superstitions that sailors maintained with the seriousness of actual religious practice. The belief that certain things brought bad luck and other things brought good luck, the rituals around death and storms, and the first sighting of certain birds, these were not simply quaint folklore. They were a way of maintaining a sense of agency and meaning in a situation where the arbitrary and uncontrollable elements of the environment had enormous power over your survival. The specific superstitions of sailors in this era are worth describing because they were both interesting in themselves, and because they illustrate something important about how human beings manage uncertainty. The belief that certain things brought bad luck was not separate from the religious faith that most men also maintained, however imperfectly. It was a parallel system of believed causation operating alongside the Christian framework, filling in the areas where Christian practice did not provide specific guidance on the practical question of how to reduce the probability of death at sea. Whistling aboard ship was considered to bring wind, which sounds harmless but could mean either a welcome wind or a storm, depending on circumstances, and the ambiguity was generally resolved in favour of not whistling. Certain animals seen at sea were either good omens or bad ones. Albatrosses were specifically and deeply unlucky to kill, based on a belief in their spiritual significance that was widespread among sailors long before Samuel Taylor Coleridge turned it into poetry. The specific phrasing used when talking about catastrophic possibilities mattered. You did not say you hoped there would be no storm, you said you hoped the weather would be fair, because to name the feared thing was to risk invoking it. The first night of a voyage was particularly significant in terms of omens. What was seen on that first night, what happened, what the weather did, who said what, all of these were read for signs of how the voyage would go. These signs were not taken as certainties but as probabilities, the way a modern person might read a weather forecast, as information to be weighed and acted upon, but not treated as infallible. And perhaps most importantly, the rituals performed around the events that could not be controlled, the storms, the diseases, the battles, provided a structure for the experience that made it psychologically manageable in a way that simply enduring the randomness without any framework would not have been. The act of performing the ritual was the act of doing something, of exercising agency, in a situation where agency was limited. Whether the ritual was effective at the metaphysical level it claimed was, in a sense, beside the point. Let us now talk about something that the story of piracy almost never addresses, which is the enormous amount of time during which absolutely nothing was happening. And I want to give this subject the weight it deserves, because understanding the boredom of pirate life is key to understanding almost everything else about it. The ocean is vast. This is known. But knowing it intellectually is different from experiencing the specific subjective reality of sailing across a significant portion of it on a vessel moving at 6 or 7 knots, which is roughly 8 miles per hour, with no radio, no books for most crew members, no way to communicate with anyone not on the ship, and nothing on the horizon except more horizon for days and sometimes weeks at a time. Between one raid and the next, between one port call and the next, could be a very long interval of essentially nothing. The ship sailed, the watches changed, the cook produced something from the stores, the rum was issued, the hammocks went up and came down, the sails were trimmed, the pumps were worked. And that was a day. And then another day exactly the same. And then another. The rate at which this could affect the psychological health of a group of men confined together with no particular variety and no escape from each other was well understood by every experienced sea captain, because a bored crew was an unstable crew. Boredom produced conflict. Conflict produced fights. Fights aboard ship were extremely serious because they could fracture the unity that kept everyone alive, and they could escalate in ways that were very difficult to contain in a confined space. Managing boredom was therefore not a recreational concern, but a genuine operational necessity. Music was one of the most important tools available, and it was valued accordingly. Every crew of any significant size had musicians, and the musicians occupied a protected status that is quite interesting from a historical perspective. When a merchant ship was captured, musicians among the merchant crew were sometimes offered the opportunity to join the pirate crew voluntarily, and sometimes they were not quite given a choice in the matter, being simply informed that they would be staying. This could seem, from one angle, like a kidnapping. From another angle, it reflected the genuine value placed on musical ability in this world. Music at sea served multiple simultaneous purposes. It provided entertainment during the long, empty stretches between action, filling hours that would otherwise be entirely empty with something engaging. It provided rhythm for coordinated work, because sailors hauling together on a rope to the beat of a work song could exert significantly more coordinated force than the same group of men trying to pull in unsynchronized silence. And it provided a social and emotional function that is harder to quantify but genuinely significant. The specific kind of morale that music creates in people who are sharing a difficult experience. There are accounts of pirate ships playing music during battles, which sounds almost absurdly theatrical, but which had genuine psychological function for men who needed to maintain courage and coordination under circumstances specifically designed to produce fear and confusion. There are also quieter accounts of evenings in harbour or during calms at sea, when music drifted through open gun ports into the darkness, and men sat on the deck and sang, and the atmosphere aboard was something that the same men during the same voyage might have said, if asked, was what made the whole thing worth it. The fiddle was the most common instrument. Small drums, various wind instruments that could be played outdoors in a wind without losing the music to the elements. And the human voice, in shanties and drinking songs and ballads and hymns that had been carried far from any church and sung in circumstances their composers had certainly never imagined. Gambling, despite being officially prohibited in the articles of many ships, was among the most persistent pastimes of every crew. Bartholomew Roberts' articles specifically forbade gaming at cards or dice for money, and this prohibition was almost certainly included precisely because gambling was so common and so likely to produce the kind of argument that ended in someone being stabbed. The evidence of this includes recovered artifacts from the wreck of the Widergall, which we will discuss later, where gaming equipment was found among the crew's possessions, suggesting that the prohibition against gambling was observed approximately as strictly as prohibitions against gambling generally are, which is to say not very strictly at all. The appeal of gambling in this context is not hard to understand. It provided structure to otherwise empty time. It created drama and tension and narrative on a scale that was manageable and self-contained. It gave men a reason to pay attention to something, to be engaged in a small ongoing story about who was going to win and who was going to lose. In an environment where the stories available were largely the same stories told many times before. Storytelling itself was probably the most universal and most important entertainment aboard any ship, and it is also the most invisible in the historical record because it was not written down, and it produced nothing that could be preserved, but it was there, as constant and essential as the salt in the air. Experienced sailors who had travelled widely had stories. Veterans of naval battles had stories. Men who had survived particular storms or particular encounters or particular pieces of luck or bad luck had stories. In the evenings, particularly in the tropics where the darkness came fast and the sky was extraordinary and the temperature was warm enough to sit on deck without discomfort, men gathered and told stories and listened and argued about stories, and told the same stories they had told before, but with embellishments added at each telling until the facts were unrecognizable. The sea, as a context, lends itself to this particular activity. The specific combination of isolation from the ordinary world and intense proximity to the same small group of people, for weeks or months at a stretch, creates a social environment where narrative becomes a kind of economy. The person with the best stories was rich in a way that the person with the most plunder was not, because the stories could be spent again and again and never ran out. Animals were kept aboard pirate ships in numbers and varieties that the popular image does not quite capture. The ship's cat was essential and practical, a working member of the crew with a clear and important job in managing the rat population. But beyond cats, there was a documented tradition of keeping more exotic companions, particularly in the Caribbean where the wildlife was extraordinary, and access to unusual animals was available at every port. Parrots were genuine and valued companions, not merely decorative accessories. A parrot that could speak was entertaining in the way that any unpredictable, sharp-tongued, occasionally inappropriate conversational partner is entertaining. And on a ship with no newspapers and no books for most people and no way to communicate with the outside world, a bird that could talk was an astonishing and endlessly diverting form of engagement. The parrot could be taught to repeat phrases heard on the ship, which created the potentially awkward situation in which the parrot repeated things in the presence of visitors or prisoners that had originally been said in what seemed like private, because nothing on a ship was private. Monkeys were kept. Small dogs. In at least one account I have read, a pirate ship carried a collection of tropical birds that had no practical function whatsoever and were carried purely for their colour and their sound, which says something genuinely touching about the inner lives of men who spent their working hours doing things that would have earned them a date with a rope. Something that very few people know about pirate ships, and which I find genuinely delightful, is that there are documented accounts of pirate crews performing theatrical entertainments aboard ship during periods of idleness. Not formal productions with costumes and scripts, though in some accounts these get surprisingly elaborate, but informal theatrical activities in which crew members performed scenes, improvised characters, or reenacted stories for the entertainment of their shipmates. This was not unique to pirate ships. Theatrical activity aboard merchant and naval vessels of the period has been documented in various forms. But on pirate ships, where the crew had both more idle time and more creative latitude in how they spent it, theatrical performance seems to have been a genuine and recurring feature of life. The specific form it took varied. Sometimes it was straightforward storytelling performed for effect, with gestures and different voices for different characters. Sometimes it was more explicitly theatrical, with men taking on specific roles in improvised scenarios. There are accounts of pirate crews performing mock courts, setting up a theatrical trial of a captain or officer from a captured vessel, with crew members playing various legal roles that were partly entertainment and partly a kind of outlet for the particular social tensions that built up in confined spaces. Navigation instruction was another thing that happened aboard some pirate ships during periods of idleness, and this is interesting for what it suggests about the social dynamics and the long-term aspirations of some crew members. The captain of any vessel had to understand navigation, specifically the use of instruments like the quadrant and later the sextant to determine the ship's position from the angle of the sun and the stars, and the use of charts and compass bearings to plot a course. These were skills that could be taught and learned, and some pirate captains passed them on to willing crew members. A man who could navigate was significantly more valuable than a man who could not, both on a pirate ship and if he subsequently wanted to work in any other maritime capacity. Teaching navigation was therefore not purely altruistic on the captain's part. It increased the ship's resilience by distributing the critical knowledge of how to actually steer the vessel across more than one person, but it was also something that sailors genuinely valued for the competence it conferred, the sense of being able to read the sky and the sea and know where in the world you were. The stars, in a world without electric light, were always present at night in a way that modern people who have never been far from a city barely imagine. The Milky Way was not a faint smear in the sky, but a dense river of light. Individual constellations were vivid and easy to identify. The motion of the stars across the night sky, the way different stars rose and set at different times and seasons, was something sailors who slept on deck watched, and came to know the way city people know traffic patterns and street layouts, as the familiar geography of the world they actually inhabited. Physical contests and games provided another layer of activity. Wrestling was common, and provided both entertainment for the participants and spectator interest for everyone else. Competitions of strength and skill, contests in throwing or in various tests of physical ability happened informally and regularly. These served multiple purposes simultaneously. They passed time, they maintained physical fitness that the work of sailing alone did not fully develop, and they provided a relatively safe outlet for the competitive energies of a group of men who were, let us remember, all carrying weapons and all fully capable of using them. The informal social hierarchy aboard a pirate ship was complex and interesting. There was the formal hierarchy established by the Articles, with the captain and quartermaster at its apex and the various specialist roles, the carpenter, the surgeon, the cook, the gunner, arranged below them with the common crew members at the base. But running parallel to this formal structure was an informal hierarchy of reputation, skill and personality that was in many ways more socially significant in daily life. The man who was genuinely skilled at his work, who could climb to the masthead in bad weather with a speed and confidence that commanded respect, who could manage a gun crew in the chaos of a battle with a calmness that kept everyone around him functioning, who could navigate by the stars with a reliability that kept the ship where it needed to be. That man had a status in the informal hierarchy that his formal position might or might not reflect. The man who was the best storyteller, who could hold the attention of a group of tired and bored sailors for an hour with a story about something he had seen or done or been told, had a social standing that was real and meaningful. The man who was funny, who could find the absurdity in their shared circumstances and give the group a way to laugh at it rather than simply endure it, was genuinely valuable. These informal currencies of worth and status were traded continuously, and they shaped the social texture of the ship in ways that the formal Articles did not quite capture. Wrestling was common and provided both entertainment for the participants and spectator interest for everyone else. Competitions of strength and skill, contests in throwing or in various tests of physical ability, happened informally and regularly. These served multiple purposes simultaneously. They passed time. They maintained physical fitness that the work of sailing alone did not fully develop. And they provided a relatively safe outlet for the competitive energies of a group of men who were, let us remember, all carrying weapons and all fully capable of using them. Now I want to turn to a question that I think is genuinely important and genuinely underexplored in most tellings of the pirate story. Who were these people? Not as romantic archetypes, not as figures in a myth, but as actual human beings, with actual histories and actual reasons for being where they were, because the answer to this question is both more diverse and more specific than popular culture would have you believe, and understanding it changes the pirate story in ways that I think make it considerably more interesting. The single most common background for a Golden Age pirate was, perhaps surprisingly, the Royal Navy. Not the merchant service, though that was a close second. Not some life of adventure seeking freedom. The Royal Navy. The institution that was supposed to be the pirate's greatest enemy. Understanding how this happened requires understanding something about the Royal Navy in the early 18th century that makes its own story considerably less glamorous than naval history often presents it. The Royal Navy in this era was not a volunteer force in any meaningful sense. The press gang, the institution by which the Navy could legally seize any physically capable man and force him into naval service, was extensively and routinely used throughout the period of the wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and during the peace that followed. A press gang was a group of Navy men, authorised by a warrant called a press warrant, who could enter taverns, warehouses, docksides, marketplaces, and essentially any public space, and take any man they judged to be physically capable and experienced enough to be of use at sea. Sailors were especially prized targets because they already knew how to work a ship and could be put to useful service immediately rather than requiring extended training. But any able-bodied man was theoretically fair game. You could be walking home from work, you could be sitting in a tavern, you could be loading cargo on a dock, and then you could be a sailor, by force, on a ship that was leaving port within days, for a voyage of unknown duration to destinations you had not chosen. Once aboard a Navy ship, your circumstances were not comfortable. Pay was consistently in arrears. The Navy routinely owed men months of back wages, sometimes more, with no particular mechanism for sailors to compel payment or seek redress. Discipline was severe and arbitrary in ways that differed between individual captains. The cat-o'-nine-tails, that multi-tailed whip, was the standard disciplinary tool of the Navy officer, and it could be applied at the captain's discretion for a wide range of offences without the intervention of any higher authority. The food was the same food you would find on any ship of the period, because the same practical constraints applied, but the management of Navy food stores was subject to the same corruption and mismanagement that characterised government provisioning more generally, and sailors who had been cheated of their rations or given spoiled provisions had essentially no recourse. Medical care for injured sailors was theoretically available through Greenwich Hospital, a charitable institution established for the purpose, but access to it was uncertain, and the care it provided was limited. When a man finished his term of service, his discharge from the Navy was at the Navy's discretion, and the Navy was famously reluctant to release trained men, meaning that men who had completed their legal obligation might remain pressed into service for months or years beyond the term of their enlistment. Given this context, the calculus of piracy becomes very different from how it appears in the romantic version. A man who had been press-ganged into the Navy, who had seen colleagues flogged for minor infractions, who had not been paid for months, who had watched crewmates die of disease or injury with no compensation to their families, and who had been told he would be serving additional years beyond what he had agreed to, would encounter the articles of a pirate ship as something remarkable. A document that guaranteed his pay, that specified his rights, that limited the authority of the captain, that provided for injury compensation, and that gave him a vote in the decisions that affected his life. The appeal is not mysterious. Among the most historically significant and consistently under-acknowledged aspects of Golden Age piracy is the substantial presence of black sailors, including men who had escaped from enslavement, in pirate crews. The world of the early 18th century Atlantic was defined in part by the slave trade, and the Caribbean in particular was the heart of a plantation economy that trafficked in human beings on an enormous scale. The ocean offered something the land did not, a space where escape was possible, and where the normal mechanisms of recapture could not easily follow a ship once it was at sea. Several significant pirate figures were black or of African descent. The figure known as Black Caesar was a man of African origin, possibly a chief or man of standing in his original society, who survived a shipwreck off the Florida coast and subsequently became a pirate operating in the Florida Keys and the Caribbean. His later career brought him into association with Blackbeard, and he was one of the small group of survivors captured after the battle that killed Blackbeard in 1718. Bartholomew Roberts, whose articles we have already discussed, commanded crews that included substantial numbers of men of African origin. Some of these men had been captured from slave ships during Roberts' raids, and had been offered, or had seized, the opportunity to join the pirate company. Roberts' articles included explicit provisions about the status of black crew members, reflecting the reality of their presence and their contributions. The specifics of what these provisions said, and what status they actually conveyed, are matters that historians have debated in detail, but their existence at all is notable. The racial composition of pirate crews in the Golden Age was considerably more diverse than the popular image suggests, and this diversity was both a product of who was available in the Atlantic world of the period and a product of the particular logic of piracy, which was less interested in social categories than in capability and loyalty. On a pirate ship, a man's background was less relevant to his standing than his ability to do the work and his adherence to the articles. This was not idealism, it was practical. The age profile of pirate crews in the Golden Age is something that surprises people when they look at the actual numbers rather than the romanticized image. The average pirate of the Golden Age was young. We are talking predominantly about men in their late teens and their 20s. The physical demands of life at sea, climbing rigging, hauling on ropes in all weathers, handling sails in storms, required physical capacity and stamina that men in their 40s and 50s found difficult to maintain. And the Golden Age of Piracy was a young man's world in the most literal physical sense. Some crew members were younger still, boys in their early teens who worked as powder monkeys during battles, carrying gunpowder cartridges from the magazine to the guns in the confusion of a fight. Boys who appear in the historical record as having been taken from captured ships or who had signed on voluntarily in port, drawn by the stories. Too young to fully comprehend what the stories did not say. The shoes of children recovered from the wreck of the Widegal confirmed what other records suggested, that young teenagers were present as crew members on at least some pirate vessels. Sam Bellamy, who went down with the Widegal in 1717, was himself 28 years old at the time of his death. Charles Vane was probably in his 30s. Bartholomew Roberts was in his 30s when he began his pirate career. These were not old men. They were men in the prime of their physical capabilities, making choices about their lives in circumstances that offered very limited options. The specific route by which individual men came to be aboard pirate ships in the Golden Age varied considerably, but there were recognizable patterns. The most common path was through the Royal Navy, where conditions, as we have discussed, created a steady supply of men who had legitimate grievances and legitimate reasons to seek an alternative when the opportunity arose. The second most common was through the merchant service, where conditions were better than the Navy in some respects, but where pay was still irregular, authority was still arbitrary, and the physical demands were identical. The third was through existing pirate crews, particularly after captures where the captured crew were offered the choice to join, and some took it. Men who came to piracy through this third route were in a complicated position, because they could at trial claim, with some truth, that they had been given no real choice, and this defence was in some cases accepted and in others not. The philosophical dimension of why men chose piracy, as distinct from the purely practical calculation, is articulated most clearly in a small number of documents that have survived, and the most striking of these is the speech attributed to Samuel Bellamy that I mentioned earlier. Whether Bellamy actually said these exact words, or whether the speech was shaped and coloured in the retelling by the prisoner who recorded it and the historians who later studied it, the articulated philosophy matches what we know from other sources about the way pirate crews thought about themselves. The speech characterised piracy as a response to a world that was designed to serve the wealthy at the expense of the poor, and the powerful at the expense of the powerless. It used the language of freedom and principle in a way that is surprisingly coherent and surprisingly consistent with some of the more radical political thought of the era. Pirates knew what they were doing was illegal. They were not naive about this, but many of them did not believe it was wrong, or not simply wrong, and the distinction between those two things, legality and morality, was one they articulated with more clarity than their social station would have led anyone to expect. Women appear in the pirate record more frequently than you might expect. Although the documentation is uneven and the full extent of female participation in Golden Age piracy remains a matter of historical debate. The most famous names are Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who sailed together on the vessel commanded by Calico Jack Rackham in the early 1720s. Both women were present and active crew members, though the exact nature of their roles is imperfectly documented. The most striking detail in the trial records from when Rackham's ship was captured concerns the behaviour of the crew at the moment of capture. A Royal Navy sloop confronted Rackham's vessel, and the crew's response was, by most accounts, disorganised and ineffective. Most of the men retreated below decks. The women, Bonny and Read, and possibly one or two others, are recorded as among the very few who continued to fight. Anne Bonny is said to have gone below and told her male crewmates, in terms that the official trial record rendered in somewhat cleaned-up language, that if they had any manhood in them, they would come up and fight like men. Both women were captured and convicted of piracy. Both were found to be pregnant at the time of sentencing and received temporary stays of execution on those grounds. Mary Read died in prison of what was probably a combination of fever and the conditions of incarceration. What became of Anne Bonny is one of the genuine mysteries of the Golden Age, because the record simply stops. She disappears from the historical documentation, which has given subsequent generations of historians and storytellers a great deal to speculate about. And now let us step back from the details and look at the thing as a whole, because the Golden Age of Piracy was not a random or perpetual event. It was a specific, historically bounded moment with specific causes and a specific end, and understanding those things helps to make sense of everything within it. The Golden Age of Piracy is generally dated by historians as beginning around 1680 or 1690 and ending around 1730, a period of roughly 40 to 50 years. In the scope of human history, this is a blink. And it burned with particular intensity because the conditions that produced it were specific and temporary, and when those conditions changed, the whole phenomenon collapsed with a speed that is almost surprising given how vivid it had been. What created it? Several converging factors came together in the late 17th and very early 18th centuries to produce something close to an ideal environment for large-scale piracy. The first was the long history of privateering that preceded it. For most of the 17th century, the major European maritime powers had been using private ship captains, operating under government licenses called letters of marque, to attack each other's shipping during their various wars. These licensed pirates, called privateers, were essentially indistinguishable from illegal pirates in their methods. The only difference was the paperwork. When wars ended and peace treaties were signed, the letters of marque expired and the privateers were suddenly unemployed. They had ships, they had crews, they had skills, they had weapons, they had experience attacking other vessels on the open sea. And they no longer had any legal authorization to do so. The question of what to do with these men, and the political difficulty of actually stopping them from continuing to do what they had been trained and equipped to do, was one that colonial governments consistently failed to solve. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714 released a particularly large cohort of trained privateers and naval sailors simultaneously, and the years immediately following saw a spike in piracy that was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. The geography of the Caribbean also contributed importantly. The Caribbean Sea, with its hundreds of islands ranging from large inhabited colonies to tiny uninhabited cays, its complex and sheltered coastlines, its shallow waters that large naval ships could not navigate safely, its warm climate and reliable trade winds, and its position adjacent to the major trade routes of the Atlantic world was very nearly ideal for piracy as a practical enterprise. Safe anchorages were available everywhere. Fresh water could be found on most islands. The trade between the colonies of multiple European powers moved through these waters continuously, providing an endless supply of potential prizes, and the colonial governance of the region was inconsistent, understaffed, and in many cases too corrupt or too weak to provide effective law enforcement, even when the political will to do so existed. Nassau, in the Bahamas, became between approximately 1715 and 1718 what historians now call the Republic of Pirates. It was a harbour town whose colonial administration had effectively collapsed, whose geography made it easy to defend and difficult for large naval vessels to approach, and which had become the principal base of operations for a large concentration of pirate crews operating in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. At its peak, Nassau had several thousand inhabitants, a significant proportion of whom were active pirates, and the town's economy operated largely around the provisioning, repair, and entertainment of pirate ships and pirate crews. The level of activity there was chaotic and sometimes violent and thoroughly beyond the control of any legitimate authority. Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Benjamin Hornigold, Blackbeard himself, all of these figures used Nassau as a base at various points in their careers. The specific men who defined the public image of the Golden Age deserve a brief individual treatment, because they were specific human beings rather than types, and their specific choices and characters are interesting in themselves. Edward Teach, known almost universally as Blackbeard, is the most famous pirate who ever lived, and very probably the most carefully managed personal brand in the early 18th century. He was a large man with extraordinarily full dark facial hair, and he understood with unusual clarity the strategic value of personal terror. Before going into battle or approaching a potential prize, he reportedly wove slow-burning fuses into his beard and lit them, creating the visual effect, in the smoke and confusion of a waterborne engagement, of a man whose face was wreathed in flames and fire and smoke. This was deliberate theatre, calculated to maximise fear in the crews of merchant vessels who might otherwise decide that resistance was possible. It worked. Blackbeard's actual career as an independent pirate was relatively brief, lasting approximately 2 years between 1716 and 1718, but during those 2 years he operated with a boldness and a visibility that made him famous throughout the Atlantic world in his own lifetime. His end came in November 1718 in a battle in the shallow waters off the coast of North Carolina, where a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard had been sent specifically to deal with him. The battle was brutal, and Blackbeard's crew fought until essentially all of them were dead or incapacitated. Blackbeard himself was killed after reportedly sustaining 5 gunshot wounds and approximately 20 sword cuts before finally falling, a physical accounting that various historians have viewed with varying degrees of skepticism, but which was presented at the time with the conviction of eyewitness testimony. Maynard subsequently severed Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his vessel as a demonstration. This was not an impulse of individual cruelty, it was a deliberate statement of purpose, an announcement that a new period in Caribbean governance had begun. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, who we have discussed several times already, was in many ways a more complete and impressive figure than Blackbeard if you are measuring by operational achievement. He captured somewhere between 400 and 470 vessels over approximately 3 years of piracy. The range in the count reflects uncertainty in the historical record rather than doubt about his general success. He was killed in battle in February 1722 when a Royal Navy warship caught his vessel early in the morning and engaged before the crew, many of whom had been celebrating the previous evening with considerable enthusiasm, were in any condition to fight effectively. Roberts died at his guns. The men who survived him were taken to Cape Coast Castle in West Africa and tried, and a significant number were hanged. Roberts' death is widely regarded by historians as the effective end of the Golden Age, partly because it removed the most active and successful practitioner, and partly because the increasingly determined and better resourced Royal Navy presence that had been building for years was now demonstrably capable of catching and defeating even the most formidable pirate captain. The Acts of Grace, royal pardons offered in 1717 and again in 1718 to any pirate who surrendered voluntarily by a specified date and renounced piracy, succeeded in reducing the active pirate population significantly. Many men took the pardons. Some of them took them sincerely and retired, others took them as a temporary tactical retreat, and returned to piracy within months, which resulted in them being hanged without the possibility of claiming they had been unaware of the consequences. The economics of piracy as a business are worth understanding, because they explain both why it was attractive and why it was ultimately unsustainable. A successful pirate raid could produce an extraordinary return in a very short time. A merchant vessel carrying valuable cargo, taken without a fight, might yield thousands of pounds worth of goods and coin to be distributed among the crew. For a common crew member, a single successful voyage could produce more money than years of legitimate employment would have generated. This was the attraction at its most basic. The problem was that this extraordinary return came with extraordinary costs that were easy to discount in good times and impossible to ignore in bad ones. The ship required constant maintenance and the constant expenditure of stores. The crew required food, water, rum, and medical supplies on a continuous basis, regardless of whether any profitable action was occurring. Ships were lost to storms and to enemy action. Men were lost to disease and to combat, and to desertion and to hanging. The pool of potential prizes was not infinite, and as more pirates competed for the same shipping lanes, the available targets became fewer and better defended, and the legal environment was gradually but steadily becoming more hostile, as colonial governments received increasing pressure and increasing resources to address piracy. A rational calculation of the expected return from a career in Golden Age piracy, accounting for the substantial probability of death before the career produced significant financial return, was not as attractive as the stories made it sound. Most pirates died before they had accumulated enough plunder to retire on. Most of those who took the pardons did so because the alternative was continued activity in increasingly dangerous conditions, not because they had achieved financial independence. The romantic image of the pirate who accumulates a vast treasure through a career of successful raiding and then retires to a comfortable life was largely a myth, and a myth that was understood as such by the men living it even as they continued to maintain it for external audiences. The reality was shorter careers, fewer prizes, more risk, and less actual gold than the stories suggested. The appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718 was the decisive institutional change. Rogers was himself a former privateer, a man with direct practical experience of maritime commerce and maritime violence, and he brought to Nassau something that previous colonial administrators had lacked, which was the combination of genuine force and pragmatic intelligence. He offered those who surrendered the pardon. Those who refused the pardon he hanged from the Nassau waterfront in numbers that were intended to communicate, clearly and permanently, that the Republic of Pirates was over. He established a functioning colonial administration. He organised the physical defences of the harbour. He brought in enough naval presence to make Nassau uncomfortable for those who had not accepted the pardon. Within a year of his arrival, Nassau had been transformed from the capital of piracy in the Caribbean into a functioning colonial town that was at least nominally law-abiding. The discovery of the Widegal in 1984 by the explorer Barry Clifford, in the waters off Cape Cod where she had gone down in 1717, gave historians something invaluable: physical evidence. The Widegal had been the flagship of Samuel Bellamy, one of the most interesting figures of the Golden Age, a man who eloquently articulated the philosophy of piracy as a response to injustice, and who was known to his contemporaries for an unusual degree of personal generosity in his treatment of captured crews. Bellamy went down with his ship in a violent nor'easter storm in the spring of 1717, along with most of his crew. She lay in about 14 feet of water for 267 years before Clifford's expedition found her. The artefacts recovered from the wider Gal are the only material evidence of actual Golden Age piracy ever recovered, and they are remarkable. The ship's bell, inscribed with her name and the year 1716. Coins from dozens of different nations, representing the accumulated plunder of raids across the Atlantic world. Weapons, personal effects, medical equipment from the surgeon's kit, African jewellery and combs, evidence of the black crew members whose presence on board is confirmed by the physical record, shoes in children's sizes, suggesting the presence of young boys aboard as crew members or powder monkeys, dice and gaming tokens, confirming the gambling that the articles officially prohibited. All of it telling the story of 80 or so men who had lived a particular kind of life, briefly and dangerously, and with enormous vividness, and who had gone into the cold water of the North Atlantic one spring night in 1717 and not come up. And now, here at the end of this long night's voyage, I want to ask you to let the ship go quiet, to let the urgency of all those facts and details and stories settle, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a glass when you stop stirring, to let the thing become what it has always been, at its deepest level. A story about people, with real histories and real desires and real fears, who lived in a world that offered them very limited choices and who made the best choices they could see. The Golden Age pirates were not heroes in any uncomplicated sense. They were violent. They sometimes committed acts that we would recognise as atrocities and that their own era recognised as crimes. They participated in and profited from economic systems, including the slave trade, that caused enormous suffering. Their freedom came at a cost paid by others who had not agreed to pay it. All of that is true and matters. And also true is that they built in the middle of an ocean in the most unpromising circumstances imaginable, something that looked recognisably like fairness. They voted. They wrote down their agreements. They compensated their injured. They held their captains accountable. In a world where ordinary working men had essentially no rights and essentially no recourse, they created a space where the question of who had power was at least negotiable. That impulse, the desire for a world that was a little more fair and a little more honest, a world where what you could do mattered more than who you were born as, is not a pirate impulse. It is a human impulse. It was there on those ships in 1710, and it is here now, in all of us, in different forms, in different contexts, wearing very different clothes, but recognisably the same thing. Let the sounds of the ship fade now. The creak of the hull against the water, the whisper of rope through a block, the distant slap of a small wave against a tarred flank. Let the smell go too, the tar and the bilge and the salt, all of it drifting away like fog burning off in the morning. Somewhere on this ship, in the soft dark of the late watch, a man is looking up at the stars. They are the same stars that navigated these ships across oceans with no roads and no landmarks and no rescue if something went wrong. They are the stars that sailors of the Golden Age read the way other people read books, finding in them position and direction and a kind of company in the vast and otherwise empty night. The same stars are above you right now. Whatever is above you wherever you are, the ceiling of your room, or if you are lucky, an actual piece of the actual night sky, those stars are there, in the same positions they have always held, unchanged by everything that has happened in the 300 years since a pirate sloop sailed under them in the Caribbean Sea. The watch is changing. The men going off duty are coming below, moving quietly in the dark with the practised certainty of people who know this space completely. The men coming on are going up, into the warm night air and the stars and the soft sound of the sea moving along the hull. The ship moves through the water in her long, steady rhythm, the rhythm that becomes, after enough time, indistinguishable from the rhythm of breathing. In, out the bow lifts and falls. The stars wheel slowly above. Everything that needed doing today has been done. Everything that will need doing tomorrow can wait. Let your breathing slow to something like that rhythm now. Let your body become heavy the way it does when it has finally decided to stop holding on. You are not at sea. You are exactly where you are, in your room, in the dark, with whatever softness the night has provided you. Let the pirate ships sail on without you for a while. Let them take their risks and their rewards and their brief and extraordinary freedom out into the deep water where they belong. And let yourself drift in the other direction, toward the still and the quiet and the dark.